So, good evening, everybody. Um, Today we're going to talk about the Talmud, and I am determined to try to give this topic, which is also very broad, a little bit more focus than last week. Last week, almost necessarily, given the ground I was trying to cover last time, 2 weeks ago, the whole Bible and the whole history of ancient Israel was just so ambitious for a beginning class, for an intro class, that I felt wasn't really what I would have wanted to accomplish, and for everyone who's going to take something different out of it. But I know the range, the spectrum of knowledge within this group is from very, very little, which is fine. That's what an intro class is for, to people who are just trying to brush up on things that they might have learned in Hebrew school 100 years ago. Actually, most of you were probably less than that, but it feels like 100 years ago. And so I'm going to try to sort of hit that happy medium. But that really means that you should stop me at any point that I'm going too fast or I'm not explaining something well enough. There's no pride in authorship here. I want to make sure that you understand. If it takes a couple of extra minutes to do that, please. And so feel free to use the chat. That is probably the best way as I'm talking, because I will be sharing things on the screen. And you can raise your hand mechanically. Electronically, it won't help much to raise your hand in real life, because I probably won't see you. But, if you feel this is something really urgent that, would be helpful for everyone, you can also certainly unmute and just say, Rabbi, I got to ask you a question. We're going to try to make this as informal, maybe even have a little conversation going along. So I said that, this is very broad based. We're talking about a lot of time, but not as much as the biblical period, to talk about the rabbinic period that goes through when the Talmud was finalized, when it sort of came into its current state. Talmud is much more fluid than even the Bible, but that's around the 6th century. So we're going to cover about from the year 0. Of course, we don't think of it as that, but we'll use secular dates, or the Christian dating, from around the 1st to the 6th centuries today. And we're going to try to understand the world of the Talmud. So that will be sort of our focus, really understanding what dramatic things happened to Judaism and to Jews during this very special, very important formative period, especially the 1st century, which in many ways is the most important century in all of Jewish history, and in many ways is analogous to the 20th century. So we can relate in certain aspects of what they went through, because what they went through was a trauma beyond all traumas, the destruction of the Second Temple. So I'm going to just share a little bit here. All right. So first thing, and this is going to be kind of nice if I can do this. Yeah, I'm going into the chat and I'm giving you the link. This is for everything I'm going to show tonight, almost everything. And I'm also going to put it on the website in my blog that has I'll put the video and audio and all kinds of other stuff. But anyway, I've put it into the chat. This is the packet that has just about everything. So whatever you miss or whatever you want to focus in a little more, another time, it's on here. Anyway, this is a page of the Talmud. I'm sure, Sandy, would you like to read? I'm just kidding. I can see your face. That's why there aren't too many faces I can see when I'm sharing. So anyway, the Talmud seems to be written in several different languages. Let's see if I can get it a little bigger. This is actually the first page of the Talmud. I'll get into what is the Talmud a little later. I just want you to feel for it, to understand what we're talking about. You also can look behind me, and that is the Talmud as well. It's not the whole Talmud, actually, and it's a Talmud, but you probably can't see that well now because I'm sharing the screen, but it's a Talmud that has English translation. It's very different from the traditional Talmud. On the screen, this is a page of the traditional Talmud. If you read Hebrew, you'll notice that on the upper left, the Hebrew letter Bet appears, which is really strange for page 1, because Bet is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And there are a lot of reasons for it, but basically it could be superstition. Bet is also the first word of the Torah. Bet is Breshit. Anyway, it's not that important, but I just thought I'd point it out as an oddity. You see this, the Talmud is beautifully printed. In fact, Gutenberg printed the Bible, but the Talmud was among the first things to be printed, and of course was also hand copied for generations. You see in the middle this enlarged Hebrew term, which is the first letter of the tractate. Tractate is a section of Talmud. We'll get into that a little more too. So that's the first word. So it's just beautifully laid out. And then beneath it, you can see, I'll go down the page a little bit. This is the main body of the Talmud text. Now, you can't see here, but often when it's not the beginning of a book, you'll see the letter Mem, as you do here, but it's for a different purpose, or and Mem Tav, which will give you the hint that this is a section known as Mishnah. Mishnah is a very terse collection of laws, very terse. We'll look at some of the Mishnah too, that was written earlier than the Talmud, written during the 1st and 2nd and into the 3rd centuries in the land of Israel. And then you have, and again, I know not all of you read Hebrew, but you see 2 letters in the middle of the page, and I'm sort of put it right in the middle of my screen, that are enlarged. It's an enlarged Gimel and an enlarged Mem. If you can't read it, it's fine. It's not a big deal. But if you see the larger letters, that tells you that this now begins the commentary on the Mishnah, which is that code, that large book of Jewish laws that are very tersely written with lots of room for commentary, lots of questions, more questions than answers. And the Gemara means gamor in Hebrew, ligmor is to finish, to complete. So the Gemara is the section from the Talmud that comments on the Mishnah. So it completes the thought of the Mishnah. So now it so happens it goes well beyond this page. For every little piece of Mishnah, there's usually a lot of Gemara, and it's not written in a systematic way. For the most part, Talmudic, is not just a noun. Talmudic describes sort of a way of thinking, a way of life. When you think Talmudically, it's not just legalistically. That's a mistranslation. It's sort of obtuse. It's like going in all different directions at the same time, and yet somehow finding your way back to where you need to be to get to the resolution, if not the solution, at least the end of that section. So it's not a systematic law code. It's not going to say this means this, this, and this. It's going to bring different rabbis into a conversation. And that's really what, the whole style of Talmudic learning is, which is done in yeshivas, in Jewish academies, is pairing off, called a chavruta, or larger groups getting together and discussing and coming up with resolutions. So the Talmud is a commentary on the Mishnah. You see the Gimel Mem, that's where the Gemara begins. I'm going to really confuse you if I haven't already. I apologize, but this is by its very nature confusing. The word Gemara is often used to mean all those books behind me. The Gemara is the Talmud, but the Gemara is also just part of the Talmud that also includes the Mishnah. What can I say? The word has more than one meaning. So, all right, that's the main body. And if you look on the two sides, you see commentaries. The way a Talmudic page is designed is really beautiful. It's really just, so beautifully laid out. And we now see it being used in lots of works in English, not just Jewish ones, because it's so wonderful to have the main source on the page in front of you, and then comments on the source. So you have the Talmud, which, as I said, comes from the second, third. The Mishnah is from the first, second, third centuries. Talmud, second to sixth. That's like 400 years, 500 years. That's a lot of time. And then you have on the margins here, you have, if you read Hebrew again, you're going to see that it doesn't really look like Hebrew. This is special script of the sage Rashi, who I also mentioned briefly last week as one of the commentators on the Torah. But he's especially known for his Talmudic commentary. So you got Rashi on the inside of the page, and on the outside of the page you have, and Rashi, by the way, is 11th century France, Rhineland. And on the other side, you have, living about a century later, what are known as the Tosafot, Rashi's grandkids. Although they're not like, just his grandkids. It's a school that came from 2 generations after him, and they're commenting on Rashi. So you have Rashi commenting on the Talmud, and you have the grandkids commenting on Rashi. Okay. Thank you, Merrill. Nonlinear. I'm looking at the chat. Yes, just like the Torah, no markings. Absolutely. And just like a Hebrew newspaper in Israel, you can find copies of the Talmud, more modern versions of it, especially by Dean Steinsaltz, a modern scholar, that has the dots, that has the punctuation. But otherwise, it's sort of assumed not only do you need to know how to read without the dots, without the vowels, but much of it is in Aramaic. So you got to be able to read that too. Michael, thanks for the question. How did people get their commentaries added to the Talmud? It's, I think there was a lot of politics involved, as one would guess, but a lot of it is sort of evolutionary. It happens over time. So we have these commentaries, in the immediate margins, but then you go over to the side here, number 6, number 4, number 2, number 7. It sounds like a jokesters convention, number 7, ha ha ha. You only have to say that. But actually what you have is on the next page, here is the key. So you think I just knew all of this stuff. No, actually I did. But so now when you use your link after class, you can see, and you really don't need to know this, but you can see the thing that's important to know. Number 5, Gilyon Shas, Rabbi Akiva Eger, Hungary, 1761. So we're talking about Rhineland, 11th century, Hungary, 1761. We're talking about, the Talmud coming from 1,000 years before, and the Mishnah, the oral law, as it's also known, compiled in the year 200. This is the amazing thing about it. It's a dialogue that spans centuries. And so I don't have a Talmud to show you, an actual book here. It wouldn't be easy to show anyway. But I think I mentioned last week in terms of the Chumash, in terms of the Bible, but more so for the Talmud. The commentators you see on the page, you'll see more on the bottom, you'll see more on the side, you'll see a whole bunch in the back that are sort of footnoted to this page. We call them the boys in the back because they were boys. There's nothing we can do about it. You can't rewrite history now. We can only change it moving forward. But commentaries that are normally later than these. The first generation of commentators, including Rashi, first generations, a few hundred years, are called Rishonim. Don't need to know this, but it's just worth mentioning. Rishonim means the first ones. And the later commentaries are called the Achronim, which means the later ones. So simple enough. That's what a page of Talmud looks like. Okay, any questions? You can even unmute. Commentary still being made. Thanks for that question, Michael. Yes, just as with the Torah, but even more so, Talmudic commentary is always being made. Everyone's refining. Look, we're going to have to come up with a whole new Talmud for artificial intelligence. I think we're going to have to come up with ethics, rules, regulations, and try to tie it back to rabbinic and Torah sources to understand better how to deal with this new phenomenon in our life. So that's just one example, but absolutely nothing is closed, nothing is fixed. The Bible is somewhat fixed as a canon, the Talmud less so. In fact, there are many different printed editions. The Bible is pretty much in one edition. Okay, I want to show you a little more just to give you a feel for this intergenerational dialogue. This is what I love, because it's a timeless dialogue. So what you're looking at here, again, it's in your packet. These are the generations of scholars of just the Mishnah and the Talmud. I'm not talking about the boys in the front or the back or any of that. No Rashi here. This is, as I mentioned, we're starting around the year 0, but actually a little before. The first school of rabbis, as they started to be called, leaders before that were called kings and prophets and priests and all kinds of other things. This is a new class of leadership known as rabbis. Rav, a rabbi, means great one, by the way, which I totally accept. It's just it's an honorific anyway. So Hillel, we talk about Hillel a lot. I'm going to get to Hillel too a little later. He's one of the prime sages. He's the one from the Jewish perspective who came up with the rabbinic version of love your neighbor as yourself. He basically said, what is hateful to your neighbor, to you rather, do not do to your neighbor. Go and study. The rest is commentary. That's Hillel. And then you have Shimon ben Shetach. You get into, the later generations. These are the rabbis of the Mishnah, going to 220, from 20 BCE to 220 CE, as we say, not AD, but CE. And the one who compiled the Mishnah, this shorter book, was called Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. He's number 6 here. He's a little earlier than the end of the Mishnaic period, but he basically was the end of the Mishnaic period. He lived in Tiberias and in the north. Most of these rabbis lived in the north. All of them lived outside of Jerusalem because Jerusalem was destroyed. That's a central point that I'm going to make. So at that point, around 220, the great thing about the Talmud is that it made Judaism portable. We no longer had a temple. We could take our religion in our hands in a Torah, and all of our holidays could be anywhere. You can have Passover in any country of the world or on a boat, as a lot of people do. So Judaism found that the Jewish people really found Palestine to be a very unfriendly environment for to grow Jewish culture and actually to stay alive beyond this 2nd, 3rd century. Once you get to Constantine in 330, when the Roman Empire becomes Christian, we got to find another place. We luckily did, Babylonia. And so Babylonia became a Jewish center, sort of full circle, considering Abraham came from what is now Iraq, from Babylonia. The exile after the first temple's destruction was in Babylonia, 586 BCE. And then not as part of an exile necessarily, but more voluntarily, Jews migrated there and were able, and also had never left there from the Babylonian exile. There were always Jewish communities, and they founded academies, and they had freedom of religion to an astounding degree. When you think about how for a good 1,000 years, Judaism flourished in Iraq. And the tables turned after the Islamic revolution, but still, even then, Jews had a better time in the Islamic world than in the Christian world. That's just the way it is. Anyway, so Babylonia became the home of great academies. So you have people like Rav and Shmuel. You have all of these. Well, if you study Talmud, you know all these names. And the great thing about it is you know all these names, and they're all talking to each other through the centuries. So you can have a conversation between someone 360 in one academy commenting on what he thinks Shimon ben Gamliel meant in the year 75. And that's, and that's the Talmudic logic then comes into play, because you're trying to understand the ways of thinking of these prior thinkers, and you have many different, more contemporary thinkers coming up with different ways to understand them and constructing arguments in that way. Anyway, so these are the boys in the front. these are the Tanaim, as they're called. Tanaim are scholars of the Mishnah, and a Tana actually would repeat. Mishnah means repeat as well, because he had to memorize. There was no printing press, remember? So these people memorized everything. That's why the Mishnah is very easy to remember. It's written in a sort of almost a sing-song way. And the Amoraim are the scholars of the Talmudic period. So again, 220 to 6th century. The Tanaim and the Amoraim. I'm not writing all these down because I found that last time I just was throwing lots of words at you. You see them right here, and certainly can check it out afterwards if you want. Just to give the timeline, this is that timeline chart that I handed out last time. This is just one page of it, the page that's most relevant. Let me stop here for a second. Any questions? Am I good? Not losing you all yet? Okay. Wow. All right, but please feel free anytime to ask questions. All right, so this is all CE, AD. So Jesus has basically just died at this moment when we get onto this page. But we're now at the beginnings of Christianity, but also Judaism is in great ferment, and there's a lot of tension between the Jewish people and the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire within Palestine, excuse me. So you can see as we head down to 67, this is a very important year, 66, the beginning of the revolt against Rome. This is also known as the Great Revolt, and all kinds of reasons for it, not the least of which that over the subsequent of the prior century, Jews had really botched their opportunity to have independence. After the Maccabees, they had a few years where there was an independent Jewish state. There were actually about 70 or 80 years, and didn't work out. And they invited the Romans in, thinking that they would somehow find a way to I don't know, disarm the other side, or at least to arbitrate between two conflicting Jewish groups. And the Romans came in and said, fine, we'll just take over. So the Romans were in control of Eretz Israel at this point. By the way, the fact that Israel is turning 75 this year, and it's dealing with all kinds of conflicts too, has not gone unnoticed. All right, so year 70, the destruction, it says here, of the Qumran community, that's the Dead Sea Scrolls, but then the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. When I said the first century is one of the most traumatic centuries in Jewish history, equaled perhaps only by the 20th with the Holocaust, I'm not exaggerating, because what the Holocaust cannot be compared to anything else in terms of the numbers of people who died and the sheer amount of suffering. I mean, we won't compare it. But remember, back in the first century, they had never experienced the Holocaust. And the only religion they knew was a religion that had the temple as at its center, even though there were diaspora communities already in places like Alexandria and in Babylonia. But still, the sacrificial worship was all they knew, and it was destroyed. And the Romans decimated Jerusalem and murdered many, many thousands. In fact, things got really bad. And then 70 years later, this 70 is always coming up in Jewish history. You see 132 to 135, there was the hope that maybe the Messiah would come, or that at least the Jews would be able to rebuild the second temple, led by this star, Bar Kokhba, means son of a star, and Rabbi Akiva, one of the early Tanaim, the early rabbis, really touted Bar Kokhba's potential as a savior, and for a while he was pretty successful. In 135, the fall of Beitar, which was Bar Kokhba's fort, ends in utter devastation. Some have estimated up to 1 million Jews killed by the Romans at that point, who then take Jerusalem. Not only is Jerusalem destroyed, in fact, they didn't have good cleanup operations, so the temple was still in ruins in 135 from the year 70. Some say even smoldering still. And it's easy to understand that, because if you go to Jerusalem today, you still see the ruins of the temple. You go look down from the Western Wall, sort of where the egalitarian section prays, you see lots of huge stones that the Romans threw over. They've never been cleaned up. So they could see that all the time. And the Romans changed the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina, their capital. Rabbi Akiva and other rabbis were executed. Bad times for the Jews. And I say this because it seemed like that would be it. There was no logical reason for the Jewish people to go on. The religion would have to be transformed completely if it were ever to survive, or some miracle would have to happen to have the temple rebuilt. But that wasn't going to happen. So it was either die, give up, become Roman, or try another path. And that began in the year 70. We go back up to 70. You see Yochanan ben Zakkai. According to legend, and the Talmud is filled with legends, and we don't know sort of what's history, what's not. Josephus, a great historian, lived at that time, so he wrote, as you see on the right here, he wrote a lot about it. But we don't really know what happened. Yochanan ben Zakkai lived in Jerusalem during the siege. His students somehow were able to get him out of Jerusalem in a coffin. So they said, we're going to bury our master, our leader, please let us do that. And they did. They stuck a sword in, but it didn't kill him. And so then Yochanan ben Zakkai did what Josephus himself is also said to have done, at least Josephus says he did. Went to Vespasian and told him that he was about to become the emperor. And sure enough, you see Vespasian, the Roman emperor. So as a prize, or, he asked Yochanan ben Zakkai, what can I give you? And Yochanan ben Zakkai said, give me a chance to build an academy in a place called Yavne. Not the Jewish camp Yavne, but Yavne, right south of Tel Aviv. It's still there to this day, far from Jerusalem and away from all the politics. He started an academy and began really the rabbinic period. So that's a little of the historical background to this traumatic change. Judaism was saved by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. When I was a counselor at Jewish camps, Ramah in particular, we used to do these mock trials of Yochanan ben Zakkai, and Josephus for that matter, but Yochanan ben Zakkai, because some would call him a traitor. He left Jerusalem that was under siege. Thousands of Jews were about to get killed, or were already getting killed. And he collaborated with the Romans to start something new. What happened in Yavne, and then became the Mishnah, and then became the Talmud as we move along, is that Judaism was completely transformed, and it was depoliticized. It was demilitarized. No more Maccabees fighting wars, anything like that. We didn't control our own country until 1948, 2,000 years. Jews withdrew from history in the terms of, the political events, and instead focused on building community from within and finding God, seeking God in a more spiritual manner. And the sacrifices were replaced by prayer and gemilut chasadim, as we call it in Hebrew, good deeds and mitzvot. So much was changed. The Paschal sacrifice, since we're coming up on the holiday, everyone made pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover. That had to change. The group that founded the rabbinic movement was known as the Pharisees, Pharisees. The Pharisees were somewhat already rivals, if not, I'm going to appear now so you can actually see a screen of me for a minute, and I can see more of you. The Pharisees did not like the temple worship, did not like the aristocracy. Those were, for the most part, Sadducees, as they were called, and priests. And then there was another group that just went off into the wilderness, who were ascetics. Essenes are among them. Anyway, you don't need to know too much about them right now. We're focusing on the Talmud. So the Pharisees started their own, really, practices. Imagine, we've been fairly conservative, and I mean that with a small c, in how we've changed Judaism since the Holocaust and the State of Israel. Although it's changed dramatically. For one thing, it's become more militaristic, more politicized. But we haven't changed the Passover Seder, for instance, that much. We've added on to it. We've built it. They invented the Passover Seder. When you read in the Passover Seder about Rabbi Jose, no, it's Rabbi Yossi, but all these rabbis getting together, the Passover story in the Haggadah is not so much about the Exodus from Egypt as it is about this, how the rabbis started this practice of having a Seder, replacing the Paschal sacrifices in the temple with table rituals. The Seder plate, everything represents something that was in the temple. So it's magnificent. It's amazing when I'm telling you that, I get goosebumps when I teach about this, because they invented a reality. They invented really essentially a new religion. Christianity is every bit, and one might say, as related to the Old Testament, as they call it, as Rabbinic Judaism is to our Hebrew Bible. They're both dramatically, radically different from the Bible. And yet, they somehow found a way to link. It's still called Pesach. It's still called the holiday of Matzot, as it is in the Torah. It's just that we do it totally differently. It's still called Shavuot, except we call it a festival celebrating the Torah. They called it a harvest agricultural festival of wheat. So everything changed. And they had to spend the next 500 years figuring out what this new religion was going to be all about. So that gives me a chance to take a drink. But also, I want to make sure, any questions? Okay, I'm on a roll. Or a Bialy. Let's see. So I want to show you a few examples of what's in the Talmud. It's not written in Talmudic script, but just to sort of carry through what I've been explaining. So the Talmud itself deals with this issue of how do we deal with this issue? How do we confront the pain of the destruction of the only way of worship we ever knew? Fortunately, unfortunately, the rabbis were not vegetarians. I mean, if I had been living at the time as a vegetarian, I would have cheered the end of sacrifices. I think in some ways they did feel that there was an evolution going on, that this was a new way that was better to replace sacrifices with prayer that often remembers sacrifices. And that's what they did. They found a way to ritualize the pain. So I'll just read a little bit of the English here. This is Bava Batra, which is one of the tractates. Our masters taught, when the temple was destroyed the second temple, large numbers in Israel became ascetics, binding themselves neither to eat meat, or to drink wine. They were in mourning. Rabbi Joshua got into a conversation and said, "My children, why don't you eat meat or drink wine?" And they said, "How could we eat meat when we used to bring that meat as an offering to the altar, and now the altar is gone? How can we drink wine? We used to pour it as a libation on the altar, and now we don't do that anymore. How can we even touch that stuff? We can't eat fruit because they used to offer first fruits. We shouldn't drink any water because we used to pour water at the temple." Basically they were down to like nothing. But clearly that was not the way to go. So the rabbis came up with this formula. I'm sort of toward the bottom of this on the left side. Therefore, the sages have ordained the following. A person may plaster their house, but should leave a small space uncovered. When you're preparing all that's needed for a feast, leave out some small ingredient. If you're putting on ornaments, leave something out. So that we'll remember Jerusalem, because as it says in the Psalm, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, etc., may my right hand forget its cunning. And this is so true. And I love the idea of having ritualized grief. We do it all the time. Can anyone give me an example of how we do it in terms of the temple?
Breaking the glass at a wedding?
Absolutely. That is like the foremost example. The idea of breaking a glass, which is also probably for superstitious reasons, evil spirits. I mean, I can come up with a million other reasons too. But the real reason is this. The idea of marrying was something that they couldn't get to the point of being happy enough to join with other people. But the rabbis, who were their leaders, understood that you can't do that. You can't survive as a people unless you're willing to compartmentalize your grief, which we have yahrzeits. Same thing, we remember our loved ones who've died. We could mourn them every day of the year, but we choose one day to focus that grief so that we can live on beyond that. Judaism needed to live on too. So that's just one example. There's a lot of other examples that I shared with you. I mean, this one from Eruvin, God is shattered. Wow. You got to read some of this stuff. Since the temple was destroyed. Oh wait, you're not seeing it. Sorry. Since the temple was destroyed, there's no laughter for God, nor does the firmament appear in its full clarity. Since the temple was destroyed, a wall of iron has been interposed between Israel and God. You just go through a lot of this stuff. This is known, by the way, as Agadah. Agadah is legend. The Talmud consists of legend, Agadah, stories, and halacha, laws. So now I'm going to tell you what else is in the Talmud. Who can tell me what this is? Just making sure you're awake. This is our sanctuary. This is Temple Bethel. Can you see that? I just want to make sure you can all see that. Yeah. Okay. All right. So if you look to the right of the ark at these windows, stained glass, probably most of you have seen it and have never really noticed it. Or if you've noticed it, it looks like it's pretty, whatever. The 12 tribes are over the ark. What is this? These are known as the 6 orders of the Mishnah. Sidarim, same word we use for Passover, for the Seder. Seder means order. 6 orders. So here are 3 on the right, we got 3 on the left. This is Zra'im, seeds, Moed, sacred time, Nashim, sacred relationships, literally means women. On the other side, Taharot, purities, Kodashim, holy places, and Nizikin, justice or torts. So those are the 6 orders of the Mishnah. What do we mean by order? It's just like Passover, this Passover Seder. We're not obsessed with order as Jews, but there is a sense that religion is about taking chaos and creating order out of it. And that, by the way, is exactly how the Torah begins. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was void and unformed, and then first thing, God creates light. After the destruction of the second temple, just as with the first, I said the Torah sort of came together after the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Second temple, year 70, this is when Rabbinic Judaism comes together, and the whole purpose is to take the chaos that was their historical moment and turn it into order. So they took basically 6 areas of life and organized it. Organized it by, how do you live? How does one live? What are the things one does? And it goes into great detail, although the Mishnah itself doesn't. The Talmud, the commentaries in the Talmud do. So I'm going to take one at a time. You see this chart here. It starts with order Zra'im. Literally means seeds, agriculture. So you see number of chapters from the Mishnah. Babylonian Talmud, that's the Talmud we basically talk about. There was a second Talmud that was written in the land of Israel contemporaneously. The Jerusalem Talmud, it's much shorter, although you wouldn't think so from this order. Much fewer commentaries, many fewer commentaries. The reason this order has almost no Babylonian Talmud for any of this, gleanings, tithe produce, sabbatical year, heave offerings, tithes, fruits of young trees, all these laws. Why do you think there's very little about it in the Babylonian Talmud? Anyone want to guess? You can just say it if you know it, or you think you know it. Okay, Babylonian Talmud was written in Babylonia. All of these laws apply to the land of Israel. They didn't even have a prayer, although they wanted to preserve these chapters of the Mishnah, which were written in the land of Israel, but they had no way of expecting to be able to go back to Roman ruled and then Byzantine and later on Muslim, Crusader, etc. There was never going to be a chance for Jews to live en masse, to move en masse to the land of Israel while the Babylonian Talmud was being formed. So there's nothing in there except for the top one, which is brachot. Brachot means blessings. And basically, as you see, it's not so much about the agriculture, but it's about our gratitude for the bounty of our land. Zra'im is seeds, it's sacred land. So brachot has a lot, that tractate has an awful lot of our prayer book in it. If you want to know, for the very beginning of brachot, that page I showed you at the beginning, the first question is, when do you say the Shema? The prayer, the Shema. This was a question they asked 2,000 years ago. So anyway, that's Zra'im, sacred land. So we're organizing life into these 6 different categories. Moed, second one down. Sacred, whoops, sorry, I went too far. Sacred times. So we have space and we have time. And if you look down the list of sacred times, you'll recognize many of these because they have to do with Jewish holidays. The Sabbath, Psachim is Passover, Yoma is for Yom Kippur, Sukkah, Tabernacles, Rosh Hashanah, Tanit for fast days, Megillah, Purim. There's one holiday conspicuously missing here, by the way. I mean, Shavuot, sort of, but Purim. No, Purim's there, Megillah. Hanukkah. There's almost nothing in the Talmud about Hanukkah. The rabbis did not like the Maccabees. The whole militarism thing, they just didn't. So, anyway, Moed, sacred times. Nashim, sacred relationships. I mentioned Nashim literally means women. So, laws of marriage, divorce, relationships, basically. Nizikin, these are damages, justice, property law, torts, civil law, qualifications for judges. They should send this over to Israel right now. Oaths, idolatry, avodah zarah. If you look at this list of Nizikin, the tractates for Nizikin, the one second from the bottom, it's interesting, and I'll conclude with that at the very end of this session. It's called Avot, Pirkei Avot. You may have heard of it because rabbis are often quoting from it. I certainly do. Ethical maxims and aphorisms. You know, most of the Mishnah and the Talmud are trying to teach us how to act and what to do. The Avot is trying to teach us why. And really, it's basic ethics. Avot is actually a training manual for rabbis. So it's found in the Mishnah, and you see it there. It doesn't have any Talmud associated with it. It's just in the Mishnah. All right, so then you have Kodashim, which it was about animal offerings and all the offerings. Interestingly enough, there is a lot of Babylonian Talmud for that, even though the temple had been destroyed. They sort of wanted to be ready, I guess, in case the temple comes back. And Taharot is purities. Very obscure. Don't want to get into it in great detail, but the idea of you contact with different things makes you a pure or impure. From a ritual perspective, some compare it to the childhood affliction of cooties, basically, or tag you're it, or whatever. But anyway, that's Taharot. So that's the sixth one. Those are the 6 orders of the Mishnah and corresponding sections of the Talmud. Okay, so how are we doing now? Any questions? Haven't lost you all yet. Oh, someone has a question. All right. So what I want to do now.
Rabbi, I have a very quick question. Does the ritual purification of the dead, the tahara, does that come from this last part of the?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, the word is the same. It's purification, and so one wants to be purified before entering the hereafter, basically. So what I'm going to do now, we're just going to have a little exercise of rabbinic philosophy. I've given you a whole lot of history, so let's do some rabbinic ethics and philosophy. So this is Pirkei Avot. I mentioned it just a minute ago. This is the rabbi's how-to manual of how to be a rabbi. But it really is how to be a mensch. And we study Pirkei Avot a lot. This is also from the packet that I linked to, so you can find it. It's toward the end. You'll notice, first of all, number 1, you see at the beginning on the right, Moses received Torah at Sinai and handed it on to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, elders to prophets, prophets handed it to the men of the great assembly. That is a fascinating line, because historically we have no idea. Question of who wrote the Torah, all of that, I started to talk about that last week. But they're trying to make a direct link between the written Torah, as we call it, and the oral Torah, as it is called. Rabbinic literature, the Talmud, the Mishnah, There are other parts of rabbinic literature, the legends known as midrash. They're all called the oral law, but they're equally valid, slightly a little less, but basically equally authoritative, because they come in a direct line from Moses. Moses had the Torah. He wrote the Torah down. According to tradition, this is the traditional way of looking. But actually, even the Talmud comes from Moses. There's a great story in the Talmud where Moses, is really jealous that there's going to be great scholars after him. And God plops him down into the back of a classroom. It's almost like the Jewish version of A Christmas Carol. But Dickens probably couldn't have written this. Moses is in the back of Akiva's classroom. So this is now centuries after Moses' death. He's watching Rabbi Akiva teach a class, and Moses cannot understand a word. He can't understand a thing. You think you have problems sometimes with Hebrew, whatever, Aramaic. Moses didn't understand the concepts, everything. But then at the very end, Moses really upset. He's frustrated. He's depressed. And then at the very end, Akiva says, Rabbi Akiva, the greatest rabbi of all time, other than Moses, this is the law according to Moses, our teacher. Which is an amazing thing to say when what you're saying really did not come from Moses. But the tradition is very strong that it all came from Moses. That there's a direct line from Moses through the rabbis. You can be a cynic and say, yeah, this is the way the rabbis could consolidate their power. And that's indeed true. The rabbis made some enormous changes in Judaism, and they needed to have authority to do that. It was very hard to count on God for that authority. There's even a story that's in this packet. I'm not going to have time to read it today, where God is overruled by the rabbis, and God says, hey, you win. You win. So there's a tremendous issue of authority and power here. But that first section of Avot really is sort of the most important thing that the rabbis would want people to know. They are authoritative. So then each of the rabbis in Pirkei Avot has something to say. Remember I said the Mishnah is written in very terse language that could easily be memorized. So in Hebrew, what are the three things that the men of the Great Assembly said? Hevu metunim badin, vehamidu talmidim harbe, v'asu siag l'Torah. It's, it's sort of like it has a ring to it. Be prudent in judgment, number one. Raise up many disciples, and make a fence for the Torah. Each one of these is a gem. First of all, it tells you about the priorities of the rabbis. Justice is a priority. Prudence, injustice is a priority. Education is a priority. Raise up many disciples. Make a fence for the Torah. That's a common expression that we often use. You'll hear me use from time to time, which is that the Torah is important, but we should add on to it. We should build it so that we can follow it more precisely. We should, like for instance, we don't light candles right at sunset because God forbid we should light candles a minute too late. So we light candles 18 minutes before sunset. That's known as building a fence around the Torah. So anyway, I'm going to give you just some of the famous ones here in chapter 1. Simon the Righteous was one of the last survivors of the Great Assembly. This is sort of we're not even sure who they were, but the Great Assembly was this transitional group between the prophets and kings and the rabbis. So 3 things. Al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed. That might be familiar to a few of you. Al haTorah v'al havodah v'al gemilut chasadim. If it's not familiar, I'm going to say it in English. It's right here. On 3 things does the world stand: on the Torah, on the temple service, and on deeds of loving kindness. Torah, avodah, gemilut chasadim. Interesting, because the temple service is no longer happening. Although it may have still existed in Simon the Righteous's day, when the rabbis compiled all of these sayings, it no longer did, but it was replaced basically by prayer, as I mentioned. So remembering the temple service is a foundation of the world. They wanted to hold that memory. And most important, the last one, is to go beyond the Torah and the temple service and prayer and everything to act like a mensch. They're pretty contemporary in what they said. And you should do it not for expectation of a reward. Remember, they lived at a time when everyone was talking about going to heaven, inheriting the world to come, or the Messiah coming to us. It says, let the fear of heaven be upon you. Be like servants who serve the master, not on condition of receiving an award. So you can see some of these other sayings that are here, some of them fascinating, some of them infuriating, some of them, frankly, a little embarrassing. You'll have to find the ones that are. There's one that says, don't go near a woman. Don't talk too much with women. That's number 5. I have no responsibility for that. What can I say? They were somewhat misogynistic. No excuses. But you can still compartmentalize and understand hospitality is very important. Helping the poor is very important. And not being sidetracked by triviality, which is what they equated with talking with women. We can just say we shouldn't be sidetracked by triviality. We should, small talk can only get you so far. And interestingly, there's a little commentary here. Doesn't help much. Anyway, set up a master for yourself. Number 6, Yehoshua ben Parachia. Find a teacher. Get yourself a disciple and a companion. Give everyone the benefit of the doubt. This is stuff that's important for us. Love work. Number 10, hate authority. Don't get too friendly with the government. Practical when you're dealing with Romans who are very likely to kill you if you get too close to them. Hillel and Shammai, who are, part of this collection, be disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving people and drawing them near to Torah. That's a beautiful concept. And Hillel and Shammai were arch enemies, but they could be responsible for these sayings together. So you get a little flavor of the Talmud. All right. As I said, there's another story in there beginning on page 8. If you want to look at it on your own, it's going to be hard. Maybe I'll do, maybe in a couple of times we'll talk a little about that. But I think, at this point, it's a good place to stop. There's an awful lot of material here. But I think, my goal was to focus it on this whole concept of this brand new reality that the rabbis created, and how miraculous it was, and how amazing it was, and how it is the foundation of what is now Rabbinic Judaism. And actually, I add one more thing. Rabbinic Judaism, the rabbinic period of Judaism, there's a biblical period, rabbinic, etc., modern, it ended with the Enlightenment in the 18th, 19th centuries. We still talk about Rabbinic Judaism. We still have many Orthodox Jews. But although we do follow many of the practices, our whole mindset, our whole worldview has changed so dramatically, even among the very observant, the scientific mind, historical thinking, and the influence of the Holocaust and the state of Israel. Things have changed so dramatically. There are so many different Judaisms out there, not just Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, Renewal, but Zionism, socialism. I mean, so many expressions of Judaism, Yiddish, Bundists, secularists. Judaism has gone in many different directions. We can share a language with Rabbinic Judaism, which is important. More than almost any other Jewish ritual, Jews at a very high percentage will be sitting down to seders in a couple of weeks. There will be 2 seders for every single, two different kinds of seders, like 2 Jews, 3 synagogues, 2 Jews, 10 seders, because we're all taking very different perspectives into it. So Rabbinic Judaism is pretty much now evolving into something that is very different, many things that are very different. How the Jewish people stays together is the drama that we're going to be playing out, just as our ancestors did in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries. So that's all I got. But if anyone has any questions.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Go ahead, Sandy.
Many, many years ago, you did a class on Talmud.
Yes.
It had to be 15 years ago.
Oh, more.
And one of the things, and
I've done others, but
yeah, this one class, I found that when we looked at the Talmud in Hebrew and we looked at the commentaries, very often we came down to almost the dissection of one word to get its essential meaning. Now, is that what goes on today in the Orthodox yeshivot, that they sit with the commentaries and it's almost becoming a discussion of separate words and then getting the essential meaning based upon how the words are formed?
To some extent, but it's more ideas than words, or it could be directions of arguments than single words. Single words you'll see more, in the Torah, where each letter is sacred. The Talmud is also sacred, but more as a whole entity than the sum of its parts. There are people who, if you put a pin through an entire volume of Talmud, think of those books behind me, all of them, there are people who will know what word it is going through, that pin is going through on each page, which is just astounding, to be able to learn that. That Talmud class that I taught, there have been many different times we've taught Talmud, but the special class, the first year I was here, and I was the assistant rabbi, so I didn't take vacation in the summer when Rabbi Goldman was away. We did a Talmud class through the course of the summer, and we thought, let's call this the year of the Talmud. When they were starting to do the Daf Yomi, the page of the day, in Orthodox circles. We had about 50 people sitting around in the library every week, and it was so exciting. It was really a wonderful thing. And I just gave you the opening lecture notes from that. So the introductory session was the same as it was 35 years ago, because the Talmud hasn't changed. But thanks for bringing that up, Sandy.
So it seems like there could be much more interpretations of the Talmud than of the Torah, because there are commentaries of, and I will now turn it over to Judy.
Go ahead, Judy.
So my question is, all of this work these rabbis did and the 6 categories, do we know if this happened over time or did it come from one academy?
Different academies. And each, these arguments get sewn together, sometimes illogically. Like sometimes it's if you read a section of Talmud, it'll seem like stream of consciousness, where a rabbi will say da 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 da, and I had a piece of meat, and then someone will say, speaking of meat, and get into another series of arguments or discussions that had nothing to do with the first group was saying. Sometimes it'll usually come back around, and it's a fascinating way of looking at it, but it's different academies, different generations.
Okay, that's what I wondered.
And so there are people who now critically look at the Talmud, who try to re-establish what the original editors were doing, because there were editors who put it together, what they had in mind, and maybe even correcting them when it seems like it sort of went off too far into a tangent. So So over the course of those 500 years, it evolved. I wouldn't say that the Talmud was put together over the weekend, with someone with, artificial intelligence and just programmed it. Here, put all these texts together. It wasn't quite that simple.
Okay, thank you.
I just have a thought, or I was wondering as you were speaking. I mean, what's the relevance of all these volumes that we see behind you to Jewish life today? Because I think that 95% of the Jews, including in Israel, have no idea about the Talmud. I mean, they don't know what it says. Maybe a few proverbs here and there people use, but
Right.
it really has. It's really. I mean, I don't see so I'm trying to see how do we have, if we have a connection between all this unbelievable work done over the thousands of years and a daily Jewish life.
Well, the Talmud itself is almost studied for its own sake. You'll have well-trained rabbis being able to pick some here and from there to put together arguments for specific case law. I mean, the rabbis back then, they just basically sat around and determined, who had to give whom something because of damages that were incurred. I mean, it's very practical case law that you see with so much of the Talmud. What we focus on tends to be the more ritual-oriented sections. What is kosher? How do we observe Pesach? What is, Shabbat laws, things like that. But the Talmud is filled with much more practical stuff on how to live in a just and organized and godlike society. So I think there is some practicality to it. Now, what's happened recently, because the state of Israel, for the first time, Jews have power in 2,000 years, Jewish values now become very relevant. So we've done a lot of work with the Hartman Institute, for instance. They've been working very hard at trying to find ways where Jewish law, the Talmud, can be relevant to creating a modern state. So there is relevance to it in the state of Israel. Unfortunately, it's been hijacked so much by the ultra-Orthodox, who have just steered off in a whole different direction that I don't think the original rabbis ever wanted, in being so parochial and unethical. So that's a great question, though, and I think we need to find ways to make it relevant. These are our sources. Now, the other thing, I'll say one more thing about that. After the Talmud, there's a whole series of works known as codes, where Jewish law is organized from these, random stories and midrash into actual codes of law that can be followed much more methodically. Maimonides being the greatest example with his Mishnah Torah, his code of law, and the Shulchan Aruch, that became the authoritative Jewish code of law from the 16th century, much more recent.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So anyone else? Well, this is great. I'm glad we were able to hang together. A reminder that next week we have sort of a double header, but we're going to be making up for the double session next week in that we're going to be off for a few weeks. Look at the flyer and you'll see that, because of Pesach, and then I have another speaking engagement later in April. So we're going to miss a few weeks, and then we'll catch up again after that. But next week, Pesach, Jewish calendar, and Michael Feldstein on Maxwell House Haggadahs. See you all then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And I'll send you the recording once it's, once I'm